Why nobody survived medieval hospitals. The horrifying truth. Introduction. The death houses of medieval Europe. When we think of hospitals today, we imagine places of healing, sterile environments where skilled doctors use advanced medicine to cure the sick. But if you had the misfortune of falling ill in medieval Europe, the last place you'd want to end up was a hospital. These weren't centers of healing. They were death houses, places where the sick went to die, often in conditions so appalling that they would make a modern person physically ill just to witness. The medieval hospital was not a place of medical treatment as we understand it today. Instead, it was a bizarre fusion of religious institution, poorhouse and charnel house, where the dying were warehoused alongside the insane, the destitute, and the diseased. To understand just how nightmarish these places were, we need to journey back to a time when medicine was based on superstition, when hygiene was considered unnecessary, and when the very treatments designed to heal were more likely to kill. This is the story of why nobody survived medieval hospitals, a tale of medical ignorance, religious fervor, and human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. Chapter 1. The birth of the medieval hospital, origins in chaos. The concept of the medieval hospital emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The Romans had developed a sophisticated system of military hospitals, valetudinaria, that provided actual medical care to their soldiers. These facilities had running water, proper drainage, and were staffed by trained medics who understood basic principles of hygiene and wound care. But when Rome fell, this knowledge was largely lost, replaced by a Christian worldview that saw illness as divine punishment and suffering as a path to salvation. The first medieval hospitals appeared in the Byzantine Empire around the 4th century, but they were fundamentally different from their Roman predecessors. The Pantocrator Monastery in Constantinople, founded in 1136, is often cited as an example of advanced medieval medicine. But even this model facility was a house of horrors by modern standards. Patients were crowded into long halls with no privacy, no understanding of contagion, and treatments that included bleeding, purging, and the application of heated metal to wounds. The monastic influence Christian monasteries became the primary providers of medical care in medieval Europe, not because monks were trained in medicine, but because caring for the sick was considered a religious duty. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, stated that the care of the sick is to be placed before and above every other duty. This sounds noble until you realize that medieval monks believed illness was caused by sin, and that prayer was more effective than medical treatment. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded around 650 CE, became the model for medieval hospitals across Europe. Its name literally meant House of God, which should have been a warning sign. The facility was run by Augustinian nuns who had no medical training whatsoever. Their primary qualification was religious devotion, not medical knowledge. They believed that their prayers and the patient's suffering would lead to salvation, whether in this life or the next. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Death. Overcrowding beyond belief medieval hospitals were designed with one principle in mind: pack as many people as possible into the smallest space The Great Hall of the Hôtel Dieu in Paris was 260 feet long and 35 feet wide, with beds arranged in rows so close together that patients could literally touch each other. But even this description makes it sound more organized than it actually was. In reality, beds were shared by multiple patients, regardless of their condition. A person with a broken leg might share a bed with someone dying of plague, while a woman in labor might be placed next to a patient with leprosy. The beds themselves were nothing more than straw mattresses that were rarely changed, becoming breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and other parasites. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome, founded in 1198, was considered one of the most advanced medical facilities of its time. Yet records from the 14th century show that patients were routinely placed 6 to a bed, with the dead often left alongside the living for hours or even days before being removed. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, rotting flesh, and death that permeated every corner of the building. No understanding of sanitation. The medieval concept of cleanliness was fundamentally different from ours. Water was considered dangerous because it could carry bad air, miasma, which was believed to cause disease. As a result, patients were rarely washed, and the facilities had no running water or proper drainage systems. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, founded in 1123, had a single well that served the entire facility. This well was located in the centre of the hospital courtyard, directly adjacent to the latrines and the area where medical waste was dumped. The contamination was so severe that drinking the water was essentially a death sentence. But this connection wasn't understood at the time. Floors were covered with rushes, dried grass, that were supposed to be changed regularly but often weren't. These rushes became soaked with blood, urine, vomit, and other bodily fluids, creating a putrid carpet that attracted rats and other vermin. The smell was so intense that visitors often fainted upon entering, and even the staff became accustomed to working in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Chapter 3. The Medical Practitioners. Ignorance in Action. The Physician, Scholar of Death. Medieval physicians were among the most educated people of their time, having studied at universities and read ancient texts. Unfortunately, their education was based on the theories of Galen, a 2nd century Greek physician whose understanding of anatomy was fundamentally flawed because he had only dissected animals, not humans. For over 1,000 years, European medicine was based on these incorrect assumptions. The theory of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, formed the foundation of medieval medicine. Physicians believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humours, and that treatment involved restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, or inducing vomiting. This meant that regardless of what was actually wrong with a patient, the treatment was always the same: make them lose bodily fluids until the imbalance was corrected. Dr. John of Ardern, a 14th century English physician, was considered one of the most skilled surgeons of his era. His medical treatises describe procedures that would be considered torture today. For anal fistulas, he recommended inserting a red-hot iron rod into the patient's rectum without any form of anesthesia. For kidney stones, he suggested cutting into the patient's back with a knife and manually extracting the stones while the patient was held down by assistants. The surgeon. Butcher with a blade. Medieval surgeons were not doctors in the modern sense. They were craftsmen who had learned their trade through apprenticeships, often starting as barbers. The same person who cut your hair might also amputate your leg with roughly the same level of precision and care. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper lighting. The operating table was usually just a wooden board, and the surgeon's tools were crude instruments that were rarely cleaned between patients. The mortality rate for even simple procedures was astronomical. Estimates suggest that 80 to 90% of surgical patients died, either from the procedure itself or from infections that developed afterward. Henri de Mondeville, a 13th century French surgeon, wrote detailed accounts of his procedures that read like horror stories. He described amputating limbs with a saw while the patient was conscious, cauterizing wounds with red-hot irons, and removing tumors with primitive knives. His success stories were cases where the patient lived more than a week after surgery. The barber surgeon, the worst of both worlds. At the bottom of the medical hierarchy were the barber surgeons, who combined haircutting with minor surgery and tooth extraction. These men had no formal medical training and learned their skills through trial and error, mostly error. They performed bloodletting, set broken bones, and removed arrows from battlefield wounds, all with the same basic tools they used for cutting hair. The procedure for tooth extraction involved grabbing the tooth with crude pliers and pulling until something gave way. Sometimes the tooth, sometimes the patient's jaw. There was no understanding of infection control, so the same tools might be used on dozens of patients without being cleaned. The barber surgeon's shop was easily identified by the red and white striped pole outside. Red for blood, white for bandages. A visual reminder of the carnage within. Chapter 4. Treatments that killed. Bloodletting. The universal cure. No discussion of medieval medicine would be complete without examining bloodletting, the practice that probably killed more patients than any disease. Based on the theory of humoral imbalance, physicians believed that removing blood from the body would restore health. This was done through various methods, all of them dangerous and often fatal. The most common method was venesection, where a vein was opened with a sharp knife and blood was allowed to flow into a bowl. The amount of blood removed was determined not by medical science, but by astrological charts and the patient's complexion. Some physicians removed up to 2 liters of blood from a single patient, an amount that would cause severe anemia or death in a healthy person, let alone someone who was already ill. Another popular method was the use of leeches, which were applied to various parts of the body to suck out blood. The leeches themselves were often reused from patient to patient, spreading disease and infection. The demand for leeches was so high that professional leech gatherers would wade into ponds and allow the creatures to attach to their legs, then sell them to hospitals and physicians. Perhaps the most horrifying method was cupping, where heated glass cups were placed on the skin to create suction and draw blood to the surface. This was often combined with scarification, where the skin was cut with a knife before the cups were applied. The resulting wounds frequently became infected, leading to sepsis and death. Purging, emptying the body. Medieval physicians were obsessed with emptying the body of its contents, believing that illness was caused by the accumulation of harmful substances. This led to the widespread use of purgatives, substances designed to cause violent vomiting and diarrhea. The most commonly used purgative was wormwood, a plant that is actually toxic to humans in large doses. Patients were given massive doses of purgatives until they were vomiting blood and passing nothing but mucus. This was considered a sign that the treatment was working. The dehydration and electrolyte imbalance caused by this treatment killed countless patients, but physicians interpreted their deaths as evidence that the illness was too advanced to cure. Clysters, enemas, were another popular form of purging. These involved inserting a tube into the patient's rectum and pumping in various liquids designed to clean out the bowels. The liquids used included wine, vinegar, and various herbal concoctions that were often more toxic than beneficial. The procedure was performed without lubrication and often caused severe internal injuries. Trepanation, drilling into the skull. One of the most terrifying procedures performed in medieval hospitals was trepanation, drilling holes in the patient's skull to release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. This was done with crude tools and no anesthesia, while the patient was held down by assistants. The procedure began with the surgeon shaving the patient's head and marking the spot where the hole would be drilled. A sharp, rotating instrument called a trepan was then used to bore through the skull, often taking hours to complete. The patient would be conscious throughout the entire ordeal, screaming in agony as the drill bit through bone and into brain tissue. Archaeological evidence shows that some patients actually survived this procedure, but the majority died from infection, brain damage, or simply from the trauma of the operation. The fact that any survived at all was considered proof that the procedure was effective, leading to its continued use throughout the medieval period. Chapter 5. The Diseases That Thrived. The Black Death. Hell on Earth. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe in 1347 turned medieval hospitals from houses of suffering into literal hellscapes. This pandemic, which killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people, overwhelmed the already inadequate medical system and revealed the true horror of medieval healthcare. The plague arrived in Europe through trading ships from Asia, carried by fleas that lived on black rats. The disease took several forms, but the most common was bubonic plague, which caused painful swellings called buboes to appear in the lymph nodes. These buboes would grow to the size of apples and eventually burst, releasing a foul-smelling pus that contaminated everything it touched. In hospitals, plague patients were mixed with other patients, spreading the disease throughout the facility. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, which normally housed about 500 patients, was overwhelmed with over 2,000 plague victims at the height of the pandemic. The dead were piled in courtyards because there was no room in the morgues, and the living were forced to lie next to corpses for days. The medical response to the plague was utterly inadequate. Physicians fled the cities, leaving patients to die without any care whatsoever. Those who remained tried traditional treatments like bloodletting and purging, which only weakened patients further. Some physicians recommended sitting in sewers to counteract the bad air that was believed to cause the disease, while others prescribed drinking ground unicorn horn mixed with wine. Leprosy. The living death. Leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of the medieval period, and for good reason. The disease, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, slowly destroyed the nervous system, skin, and extremities, leaving victims disfigured and in constant pain. Medieval society's response to leprosy was to segregate sufferers in specialized institutions called leper houses, or lazarettes. These facilities were more like prisons than hospitals. Lepers were declared legally dead and forced to wear distinctive clothing and ring bells to warn others of their approach. They were forbidden from entering towns, touching healthy people, or even drinking from public wells. The leper houses where they were confined were places of unimaginable despair. The Hospital of St. Lazarus in Jerusalem, founded in the 12th century, was one of the largest leper hospitals in the medieval world. Patients were housed in long, dark halls with no privacy or comfort. The disease slowly ate away at their bodies, causing fingers and toes to fall off, noses to collapse, and skin to develop horrible ulcers. There was no treatment beyond prayer, and the occasional application of ointments made from animal fat and herbs. Many lepers were children who had contracted the disease from their parents. These children would spend their entire lives in the leper house, watching their bodies slowly decay while receiving no medical care beyond basic food and shelter. The mortality rate was 100%. No one left a leper house alive. Ergotism, the fire of St. Anthony. One of the most horrifying diseases to afflict medieval Europe was ergotism, caused by eating bread made from rye, infected with the fungus Claviceps purpurea. This fungus produced alkaloids that caused severe poisoning, leading to two distinct forms of the disease: convulsive ergotism and gangrenous ergotism. Both were nightmarish conditions that medieval hospitals were utterly incapable of treating. Convulsive ergotism caused violent seizures, hallucinations, and muscle spasms so severe that patients would literally convulse themselves to death. Witnesses described victims writhing on the floor, foaming at the mouth, and speaking in tongues as if possessed by demons. The medieval medical establishment had no understanding of the true cause and attributed the condition to divine punishment or demonic possession. Gangrenous ergotism was even more horrific. The alkaloids caused blood vessels to constrict so severely that circulation was cut off to the extremities. Patients would feel a burning sensation in their hands and feet, hence the name Saint. Anthony's fire, before their limbs began to turn black and literally fall off. The gangrenous tissue would rot while still attached to the body, causing an unbearable stench and attracting swarms of flies and maggots. In hospitals, ergotism patients were placed alongside other patients, where their screams and violent convulsions terrorized everyone around them. The only treatment was to tie them down to prevent them from hurting themselves or others. Many were exorcised by priests who believed they were possessed by demons. The mortality rate was close to 100%, and those who survived were left permanently disabled. Dysentery, the bloody flux. Dysentery, known in medieval times as the bloody flux, was endemic in medieval hospitals due to the appalling sanitary conditions. The disease caused severe diarrhea mixed with blood and mucus, leading to rapid dehydration and death. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval hospitals, dysentery spread like wildfire. The Hospital of St. Thomas in Canterbury recorded that during one outbreak in 1348, over 200 patients died of dysentery in a single month. The disease was so common that it was considered a normal part of hospital life. Patients would lie in their own waste for days, as there were not enough staff to clean them regularly. The smell was so overwhelming that even the priests who came to give last rites would often vomit. Medieval physicians treated dysentery with their usual arsenal of bloodletting and purging, which only made the condition worse by further dehydrating the patient. Some physicians recommended binding the patient's arms and legs tightly to prevent the humours from escaping, which caused additional suffering, but no improvement in the condition. Chapter 6. The Daily Horror of Hospital Life. A Day in Hell. The patient experience. To truly understand why nobody survived medieval hospitals, we must examine what a typical day was like for a patient. Let's follow the experience of Thomas, a fictional but representative patient, admitted to the Hôtel Dieu in Paris in 1348 with a broken leg. Thomas arrives at the hospital carried by his neighbours, who dump him at the entrance and flee quickly to avoid contagion. He is processed by a clerk who records his name in a ledger that also serves as a death register. No medical examination is performed. The clerk simply assigns him to a bed based on available space. The bed Thomas is given is shared with 3 other patients: an elderly woman dying of plague, a child with a suppurating wound, and a man suffering from what appears to be advanced syphilis. The straw mattress is soaked with the bodily fluids of previous occupants and hasn't been changed in months. The smell is so overwhelming that Thomas immediately vomits, adding to the filth around his bed. The hospital has no windows, so the only light comes from a few candles that burn constantly, adding smoke to the already toxic atmosphere. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting flesh, human waste, and death. Thomas can hear the constant moaning of other patients, punctuated by screams when procedures are performed without anesthesia. The food, poison on a plate. Hospital food in medieval times was not designed to promote healing. It was simply whatever was cheapest and most readily available. The Hôtel Dieu served a gruel made from barley, water, and whatever scraps could be found. This mixture was often contaminated with rat droppings, insect parts, and mold, but patients were expected to eat it or starve. The water provided to patients came from wells that were contaminated with sewage and medical waste. Drinking this water was often more dangerous than the original illness, but patients had no choice. Wine was sometimes provided, but it was usually watered down and often contaminated as well. Meat was rarely served, and when it was often spoiled. The hospital's storage areas were infested with rats and insects, and there was no refrigeration to preserve food. Patients frequently died from food poisoning in addition to their original ailments, but this was seen as unavoidable rather than preventable. The staff, angels of death. The nursing staff in medieval hospitals consisted primarily of religious women who had taken vows of service but had no medical training. These nuns were dedicated to their work, but were woefully unprepared for the reality of caring for the sick and dying. They were taught to see suffering as spiritually beneficial and often interpreted a patient's pain as evidence of divine intervention. Sister Margaret, a nun at the Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London, kept detailed records of her work that provide insight into the daily routine of medieval nursing. Her day began at 4 a.m. with prayers, followed by a round of the wards to check for patients who had died during the night. Dead bodies were dragged out to the courtyard, where they were stacked like cordwood until they could be buried in mass graves. The living patients received minimal care. Sister Margaret would distribute the morning gruel, empty chamber pots when available, and apply whatever treatments the physician had prescribed. These treatments were often more harmful than helpful, but she followed orders without question. She recorded that on a typical day, she would witness several deaths, numerous surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, and countless episodes of patients screaming in pain. The surgical suite, theatre of horrors, surgery in medieval hospitals was performed in whatever space was available, often in the main ward, where other patients could watch. There were no operating theatres, no sterile environments, and no anesthesia. The surgeon would arrive with a bag of crude instruments and set up on a wooden table that had been used for countless previous operations. The surgical instruments were basic and brutal: saws for amputations, knives for cutting, and crude forceps for removing foreign objects. These tools were rarely cleaned between patients and were often rusty and dull. The surgeon would sharpen them on a whetstone immediately before use, but this did nothing to remove the accumulated blood and tissue from previous operations. Operations were performed while the patient was held down by assistants. The screaming was so loud that it could be heard throughout the hospital, causing other patients to panic and adding to the overall atmosphere of terror. The mortality rate for surgery was so high that it was considered a last resort, reserved for cases where the patient was certain to die anyway. Chapter 7: The Plague Years. When Hell Became Reality. The Arrival of Death. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 aboard trading ships from the East, and it transformed medieval hospitals from houses of suffering into literal charnel houses. The disease spread with terrifying speed, killing an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in just 4 years. Medieval hospitals, already overwhelmed by normal patient loads, became epicenters of death and despair. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome, one of the largest medical facilities in Europe, recorded the arrival of the plague in meticulous detail. Brother Francesco, the hospital's chronicler, described the first plague victim as a sailor who arrived at the hospital with swollen lymph nodes and a high fever. Within hours, similar cases began appearing, and within days, the hospital was overrun with plague victims. The medical staff had no understanding of how the disease spread, so they made no attempt to isolate plague patients from others. Instead, they continued their normal practice of placing multiple patients in each bed, ensuring that the disease spread throughout the facility with maximum efficiency. The hospital's records show that the mortality rate increased from the usual 40% to over 90% within the first month of the plague's arrival. The bubonic nightmare. Bubonic plague was the most common form of the disease, characterized by the development of painful swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes could grow to the size of apples and would eventually burst, releasing a foul-smelling pus that contaminated everything it touched. In the cramped conditions of medieval hospitals, patients with bubonic plague were placed alongside those with other conditions, spreading the disease throughout the facility. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris recorded that during the peak of the plague, patients were dying so rapidly that the dead were left in their beds for hours or even days before being removed. The living were forced to lie next to decomposing corpses, breathing in the stench of death and decay. The medical response to bubonic plague was utterly inadequate. Physicians attempted to treat the buboes by lancing them with knives, causing excruciating pain and often leading to secondary infections. Some physicians recommended placing live chickens on the buboes to draw out the poison, while others suggested burning the swellings with red-hot irons. These treatments were not only ineffective, but often hastened the patient's death. Pneumonic plague. The breath of death. Even more terrifying than bubonic plague was its pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and was spread through respiratory droplets. Patients with pneumonic plague would cough up blood and experience severe difficulty breathing. The disease was almost always fatal, killing victims within 2 to 3 days of the onset of symptoms. In medieval hospitals, pneumonic plague patients were placed in the same wards as everyone else, where their bloody coughs spread the disease to other patients and staff. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London recorded that during one outbreak of pneumonic plague, an entire ward of 50 patients died within a single week. The staff began to refer to certain sections of the hospital as death wards, where no one expected to survive. The medical treatment for pneumonic plague was even more brutal than for the bubonic form. Physicians attempted to drain the lungs by making incisions in the chest and inserting tubes to remove fluid. This procedure, performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, was essentially a form of torture that rarely prolonged life and often caused additional suffering. The collapse of medical care. As the plague spread throughout Europe, the medieval medical system completely collapsed. Physicians fled the cities, leaving patients to die without any care whatsoever. Those few medical practitioners who remained were overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients and the rapid progression of the disease. The University of Paris, one of the leading medical schools in Europe, issued a report in 1348 attempting to explain the plague's cause and recommend treatments. The report blamed the disease on a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and recommended bloodletting, purging, and prayer as treatments. This was the best medical advice available at the time, and it was completely useless. Many hospitals simply closed their doors when the plague arrived, turning away patients who were almost certain to die anyway. The Hospital of St. Thomas in Canterbury recorded that it suspended operations for 6 months during the worst of the plague, reopening only when the immediate crisis had passed. Even then, the facility was so contaminated with disease that it took months to make it minimally safe for patients. Religious responses to medical failure. When medicine failed to stop the plague, people turned to religion for answers. The church taught that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, and that the only cure was repentance and prayer. This led to the rise of extreme religious movements that added to the suffering of plague victims. The flagellant movement encouraged people to whip themselves in public displays of penitence, believing that this would end the plague. Groups of flagellants would travel from town to town, whipping themselves until they bled and encouraging others to do the same. These gatherings became centers of contagion, spreading the plague even further. In hospitals, priests would perform mass exorcisms on plague patients, believing that the disease was caused by demonic possession. These ceremonies often involved forcing patients to consume holy water, applying blessed oils to their buboes, and subjecting them to hours of prayer and chanting. The stress of these rituals often hastened the patients' deaths, but this was interpreted as evidence that their souls were being saved. Chapter 8. The treatments that tortured. Mercury, the liquid death. One of the most horrifying treatments used in medieval hospitals was mercury, which was prescribed for a wide variety of conditions, including syphilis, skin diseases, and mental illness. Mercury is extremely toxic to humans, causing severe neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Medieval physicians had no understanding of its toxic properties and believed it was a miracle cure. The treatment involved giving patients large doses of mercury, either orally or by rubbing mercury ointment into their skin. The mercury would cause severe salivation, tooth loss, and neurological symptoms that physicians interpreted as signs that the treatment was working. Patients would literally drool mercury-contaminated saliva, which would pool around their beds and contaminate the surrounding area. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London kept detailed records of mercury treatments administered between 1350 and 1400. The records show that patients receiving mercury treatment had a mortality rate of over 80%, compared to about 60% for patients who received no treatment at all. Despite this clear evidence of the treatment's ineffectiveness, it continued to be used for centuries. Dr. Paracelsus, a 16th century physician who worked in several medieval hospitals, was a strong advocate for mercury treatment. He believed that the dose should be increased until the patient began to show signs of mercury poisoning, which he interpreted as evidence that the treatment was working. His patients would suffer from severe neurological symptoms, including tremors, memory loss, and eventual death from organ failure. Cauterization, burning away the disease. Medieval physicians believed that many diseases could be cured by burning away the affected tissue, a process known as cauterization. This involved heating iron instruments until they were red hot and then applying them directly to the patient's skin. The procedure was performed without anesthesia and caused excruciating pain that often led to shock and death. Cauterization was used to treat everything from hemorrhoids to epilepsy. For hemorrhoids, the physician would insert a red-hot iron rod into the patient's rectum and burn away the swollen tissue. For epilepsy, hot irons were applied to the patient's head in an attempt to burn away the evil humours that were believed to cause seizures. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome recorded over 500 cauterization procedures performed between 1300 and 1350. The records show that patients who underwent cauterization had a mortality rate of 70%, and those who survived were often left with severe scarring and permanent disability. The procedure was so painful that many patients died from shock during the treatment itself. Brother Thomas, a monk who worked at the hospital, described the cauterization process in horrifying detail. He wrote that patients would be held down by 4 assistants while the physician heated the iron in a brazier. The screaming was so loud that it could be heard throughout the hospital, and the smell of burning flesh was so intense that many of the staff would vomit. Despite these obvious signs of the treatment's brutality, it continued to be used regularly. Amputation, butchery without skill. Amputation was one of the most commonly performed surgical procedures in medieval hospitals, usually as a treatment for gangrene, severe fractures, or battlefield injuries. The procedure was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or proper surgical techniques, making it essentially a form of butchery. The amputation process began with the patient being held down by several assistants while the surgeon prepared his instruments. The primary tool was a saw, similar to those used by carpenters, which was used to cut through bone. The surgeon would also have knives for cutting through skin and muscle, and cauterizing irons for sealing blood vessels. The patient would be fully conscious throughout the procedure, experiencing unimaginable pain as the surgeon sawed through bone and tissue. Many patients died from shock during the amputation, while others succumbed to blood loss or infection in the days following the procedure. The mortality rate for amputation was over 80%, making it one of the most dangerous procedures performed in medieval hospitals. Henri de Mondeville, a 14th century surgeon, wrote detailed descriptions of amputation procedures that reveal the brutal reality of medieval surgery. He described patients screaming so loudly that their voices gave out, struggling against their restraints with such force that they often broke their own bones, and begging for death to end their suffering. Despite witnessing this suffering firsthand, medieval surgeons continued to perform amputations regularly. Bloodletting, the systematic weakening of patients. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common medical treatment in medieval hospitals, prescribed for virtually every condition imaginable. The procedure involved opening a vein and allowing blood to flow out until the physician decided enough had been removed. This was based on the false belief that illness was caused by an excess of blood or an imbalance of bodily humors. The amount of blood removed was determined by various factors, including the patient's age, gender, and astrological sign. Physicians would consult complex charts that told them when bloodletting should be performed and how much blood should be removed. Some treatments called for removing up to 2 liters of blood, an amount that would cause severe anemia or death in a healthy person. The Hospital of St. Thomas in Canterbury recorded that bloodletting was performed on over 90% of patients admitted to the facility. The records show that patients who were bled had a mortality rate of 65%, compared to 45% for those who were not. Despite this clear evidence that bloodletting was harmful, it continued to be the primary treatment for most conditions. The bloodletting process was performed using various methods, all of them dangerous. Venesection involved making an incision in a vein and allowing blood to flow into a bowl. Scarification involved making multiple small cuts in the skin and allowing blood to seep out. Cupping involved placing heated glasses on the skin to create suction and draw blood to the surface. Herbal poisons, nature's deadly remedies. Medieval physicians had access to a wide variety of plants and herbs many of which were extremely toxic. Without proper knowledge of pharmacology, they regularly prescribed substances that were more likely to kill than cure. These herbal treatments were often administered in doses that would be considered lethal by modern standards. Foxglove, which contains digitalis, was commonly prescribed for heart conditions. While digitalis can be beneficial in small doses, medieval physicians had no way to measure proper dosage and often gave patients enough to cause fatal heart arrhythmias. Patients would experience severe nausea, vomiting, and cardiac symptoms before dying from digitalis poisoning. Wormwood, which contains toxic compounds called thujones, was used as a purgative to induce vomiting and diarrhea. Medieval physicians would administer large doses of wormwood until patients were vomiting blood and experiencing severe abdominal pain. The dehydration and electrolyte imbalance caused by this treatment killed many patients, but physicians interpreted the violent reaction as evidence that the treatment was working. Mandrake root, which contains tropane alkaloids, was used as a painkiller and sedative. However, the difference between an effective dose and a lethal dose was very small, and medieval physicians had no way to measure proper dosage. Patients given mandrake would often fall into comas and die from respiratory depression. Chapter 9: The Architecture of Suffering. The great halls of death medieval hospitals were designed more like warehouses than medical facilities, with long halls that could accommodate hundreds of patients in minimal space. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, considered one of the most advanced hospitals of its time, consisted of several enormous halls, each measuring over 200 feet long and 35 feet wide. These halls were designed to house as many patients as possible, with no consideration for privacy, comfort, or medical care. The Great Hall of the Hôtel Dieu could accommodate up to 600 patients who were packed into beds arranged in rows down the length of the hall. The beds were placed so close together that patients could reach out and touch those in adjacent beds. This proximity ensured that infectious diseases spread rapidly throughout the facility, turning the hospital into a breeding ground for epidemics. The ceiling of the Great Hall was high and vaulted, designed to accommodate the massive crowds during religious services. However, this height also meant that the hall was impossible to heat properly, leaving patients shivering in the cold during winter months. The walls were made of stone and had no insulation, making the interior damp and cold year-round. Windows were few and small, designed more for defense than for providing light or ventilation. The lack of natural light meant that the halls were perpetually dark, lit only by candles and oil lamps that added smoke to the already toxic atmosphere. The poor ventilation meant that the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting flesh, and human waste accumulated over time, creating an atmosphere so foul that visitors often fainted upon entering. The beds. Shared suffering. The beds in medieval hospitals were not individual sleeping spaces, but rather shared platforms where multiple patients were placed together regardless of their condition. A typical bed in the Hôtel Dieu measured about 6 feet wide and 8 feet long, designed to accommodate 4 to 6 patients lying side by side. The beds were nothing more than wooden frames with rope or leather supports, topped with straw mattresses that were rarely changed. The straw mattresses became soaked with blood, urine, vomit, and other bodily fluids from the patients who had previously occupied them. These mattresses were breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and other parasites that would bite patients and spread disease. The smell emanating from these mattresses was so intense that it could be detected from across the hall. Patients with different conditions were placed in the same bed, without any consideration for compatibility or the risk of cross-infection. A person with a broken bone might share a bed with someone dying of plague, while a woman in labor might be placed next to a patient with leprosy. This practice ensured that patients who entered the hospital with one condition often left with several others. Bedding was minimal and rarely washed. Patients were given thin blankets that were shared among multiple people and were often infested with vermin. The blankets were so filthy that they were sometimes more dangerous than sleeping without covering. Many patients developed skin infections from contact with these contaminated textiles. The latrines, centers of contamination. The sanitary facilities in medieval hospitals were primitive and dangerous, consisting of simple latrines that were often located near or even within the patient wards. These latrines were nothing more than holes in the ground that emptied into pits or rivers, with no understanding of how human waste could contaminate water supplies and spread disease. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London had latrines located directly adjacent to the main patient ward, separated only by a thin wall. The smell from these latrines permeated the entire hospital, and the waste often overflowed into the patient areas during heavy rains. The contamination was so severe that the floors of the hospital were permanently stained with human waste. Many patients were too weak to reach the latrines and were forced to relieve themselves in their beds. The hospital staff, overwhelmed by the number of patients and lacking proper cleaning supplies, often left patients lying in their own waste for days. This led to severe skin infections and added to the overall unsanitary conditions of the facility. The latrines were also breeding grounds for rats and other vermin that would then spread throughout the hospital. These pests carried diseases and contaminated food supplies, adding another layer of danger to an already hazardous environment. The medieval hospital was essentially a perfect storm of unsanitary conditions that made recovery impossible and death almost inevitable. The mortuary, where the dead waited. Medieval hospitals required dedicated spaces for handling the constant stream of dead bodies that resulted from their ineffective treatments and unsanitary conditions. The mortuary at the Hôtel Dieu in Paris was located in the basement of the hospital, where corpses were stacked like cordwood until they could be buried or disposed of. The mortuary was a stone chamber with no ventilation or refrigeration, meaning that bodies would begin to decompose immediately. The smell of rotting flesh was overwhelming, and the chamber was infested with rats and insects that fed on the corpses. The bodies were often left in the mortuary for days or weeks, depending on the availability of burial space and the number of deaths. During plague outbreaks, the mortuary would become so overcrowded that bodies had to be stored in other areas of the hospital. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome recorded that during the Black Death, corpses were stacked in the courtyard, the chapel, and even in unused patient wards. The smell of death permeated the entire facility, adding to the psychological trauma experienced by surviving patients. The disposal of bodies was handled by the lowest-ranking hospital staff, who would load corpses onto carts and transport them to mass graves outside the city. These burial pits were often shallow and poorly maintained, leading to contamination of water supplies and the spread of disease. The entire process, from death to disposal, was conducted with no regard for hygiene or public health. Chapter 10: The Psychological Torture of Medieval Medicine. The sounds of suffering. The medieval hospital was a place of constant auditory torture, where the sounds of human suffering created an atmosphere of despair and terror. The most prominent sound was screaming. The agonized cries of patients undergoing surgery without anesthesia, the moans of those dying from disease, and the wails of those in constant pain. These sounds echoed through the stone halls day and night, creating a symphony of human misery. Surgical procedures were performed at the open wards, where other patients could hear every detail of the operation. The sound of saws cutting through bone, the sizzle of cauterizing irons burning flesh, and the desperate screams of patients being operated on without pain. Relief created a constant state of terror among other patients. Many patients died from shock, simply from hearing what was happening to others. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London recorded that patients would often beg to be discharged when they heard surgery being performed nearby. Brother William, a monk who worked at the hospital, wrote that the sounds of suffering were so intense that they could be heard from outside the building, causing people to cross to the other side of the street to avoid passing too close to the hospital. Religious services were held regularly in the patient wards, but even these were sources of psychological trauma. The constant chanting about death, judgment, and eternal damnation added to the patient's fear and despair. Many patients became convinced that they were being punished by God for their sins, leading to additional psychological suffering that hindered any possibility of recovery. The smell of death. The olfactory experience of a medieval hospital was perhaps even more traumatic than the sounds. The combination of unwashed bodies, rotting flesh, human waste and decay created a smell so intense that it was described by contemporaries as the smell of hell itself. This smell permeated everything in the hospital, from the walls to the bedding to the clothing of the staff. The lack of proper ventilation meant that these odours accumulated over time, becoming stronger and more nauseating with each passing day. Patients would often vomit from the smell alone, adding to the contamination of their surroundings. The psychological impact of being surrounded by such overwhelming odours was devastating, contributing to the sense of hopelessness that pervaded these institutions. New patients often went into shock when they first entered the hospital, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of sounds and smells. Many would beg to be taken home, preferring to die in familiar surroundings rather than endure the horror of the hospital environment. This reaction was so common that hospital staff developed procedures for restraining patients who tried to flee. The constant presence of death, perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval hospital life, was the constant presence of death. Patients were forced to watch others die agonizing deaths, knowing that they would likely meet the same fate. Bodies were often left in beds for hours or days after death, forcing living patients to lie next to corpses. The mortality rate in medieval hospitals was so high that death was not an exceptional event, but a daily occurrence. Patients would wake up to find that their bedmates had died during the night, and they would often have to wait hours or days before the bodies were removed. This constant exposure to death created a state of psychological trauma that made recovery virtually impossible. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome recorded that during peak periods, up to 20 patients would die each day. The living patients would watch as bodies were dragged from the wards, knowing that they would likely be next. This created a state of constant terror that was perhaps more damaging than the physical illnesses that had brought them to the hospital in the first place. Religious terror. The medieval hospital was not just a place of medical treatment, but also a center of religious indoctrination that often added to patients' psychological suffering. The church taught that illness was divine punishment for sin, and that suffering was necessary for salvation. This meant that patients were not only dealing with physical pain, but also with guilt and fear about their spiritual condition. Priests would regularly visit the wards to perform last rites and hear confessions, constantly reminding patients of their mortality and the possibility of eternal damnation. These visits were often more terrifying than comforting, as patients were forced to confront their sins and prepare for death. The constant religious messaging about judgment and punishment created additional psychological trauma for people who were already suffering from serious illness. The practice of conducting religious services in the patient wards meant that patients were constantly exposed to prayers for the dead and discussions of death and judgment. The Hospital of St. Thomas in Canterbury recorded that patients would often become hysterical during religious services, screaming and trying to flee from the priests. This religious terror was considered a normal part of hospital life and was even seen as spiritually beneficial by the staff. Chapter 11. The Women's Wards, Double Jeopardy, Childbirth in Hell. The women's wards in medieval hospitals were places of particular horror, where the normal dangers of the hospital environment were compounded by the risks of childbirth and the additional vulnerabilities faced by women in medieval society. Women giving birth in medieval hospitals faced a mortality rate of over 50%, making childbirth one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could endure. The birthing process was conducted in the same unsanitary conditions as all other medical procedures, with no understanding of the need for sterile environments or proper hygiene. Women would labor in beds that were soaked with the bodily fluids of previous patients, surrounded by women dying from other conditions. The risk of infection was enormous, and most women who survived childbirth would die from puerperal fever, childbed fever, within days of delivery. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London recorded that between 1350 and 1400, over 300 women died in childbirth at the facility. The records show that the mortality rate for women in labour was higher than for any other category of patient, including those with plague. This was due to the combination of the dangerous birthing environment and the complete lack of understanding about obstetric care. Medieval physicians had no knowledge of proper birthing techniques and would often intervene in ways that made the situation worse. They would use crude instruments to try to extract babies, often causing severe injuries to both mother and child. The pain of childbirth was considered punishment for Eve's original sin, so no effort was made to provide pain relief or comfort. Gynecological horrors. Women's medical problems were often treated with procedures that were particularly brutal and ineffective. Gynecological conditions were poorly understood, and treatments were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Women with uterine prolapse would have their wombs pushed back into place with crude instruments, often causing severe injury and infection. Breast cancer was treated by cutting away the affected tissue with knives, without anesthesia or proper surgical techniques. The mortality rate for this procedure was close to 100%, as women would either die from the surgery itself or from the inevitable infection that followed. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome recorded that no woman who underwent breast surgery survived more than a month. Menstrual problems were treated with bloodletting, purging, and the insertion of various substances into the vagina. These treatments were not only ineffective, but often caused severe infections that led to death. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was so poor that many physicians believed that women's illnesses were caused by the movement of the uterus around the body. Sexual violence and abuse. The vulnerability of women in medieval hospitals made them targets for sexual violence and abuse. Women patients were often assaulted by male staff members, other patients, and even clergy members who were supposed to be providing spiritual comfort. The Hospital of St. Thomas in Canterbury recorded several cases of nuns being attacked by male patients, and it is likely that many more cases went unreported. The lack of privacy in the hospital wards meant that women had no protection from unwanted attention or assault. Women would be forced to undress and bathe in front of male staff members, and intimate examinations were conducted without any regard for the woman's dignity or comfort. The psychological trauma of these experiences was often as damaging as the physical illnesses that had brought women to the hospital. The Church's attitude toward women as inherently sinful and responsible for mankind's fall from grace meant that female patients were often treated with contempt and suspicion. Women who showed signs of mental illness were often accused of witchcraft and subjected to exorcisms and other forms of spiritual torture. The combination of physical illness, brutal medical treatment, and psychological abuse made the women's wards some of the most horrific places in the medieval hospital. Chapter 12. The Economics of Death, Profit in Suffering. Medieval hospitals were not charitable institutions dedicated to healing, but rather businesses that profited from the suffering of the sick and dying. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, despite its name suggesting divine charity, was a profitable enterprise that generated income through various means, including the sale of patients' belongings, the rental of bed space, and the provision of funeral services. When patients died, their belongings became the property of the hospital. This created a perverse incentive for hospital staff to allow patients to die, as their deaths would generate income for the institution. The Hospital of Santo Spirito in Rome recorded that the sale of patients' belongings generated over 20% of the hospital's annual revenue, making death a profitable aspect of the business model. Bed space was rented to patients based on their ability to pay, with the wealthy receiving better accommodations, though still appallingly inadequate by modern standards, while the poor were crammed into the worst areas of the hospital. The Hôtel Dieu charged different rates for different levels of care, with the most expensive option being a private corner of a shared bed. The provision of funeral services was another source of revenue for medieval hospitals. Families would pay the hospital to conduct funeral services and arrange for burial, often in mass graves that were cheaply maintained. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London recorded that funeral services generated significant revenue, especially during plague outbreaks when deaths were numerous.